For nearly half a century, the world held its breath. It was a world divided, two superpowers, two ideologies locked in a tense global standoff. United States, a beacon of capitalism and democracy. USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a colossal empire, a nuclear-armed giant across 11 time zones, influence from the heart of Eastern Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Cold War, not just a political rivalry, it was a battle for the future of humanity itself. The Soviet Union projected an image of unstoppable strength. Its military might was legendary. Parades in Moscow's Red Square showcased endless columns of tanks and soldiers, missiles capable of reaching any city on Earth, a constant, terrifying reminder. The space race was another front in this conflict. The Soviets shocked the world with Sputnik, the first satellite. They sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. For many, it seemed the communist system was not just viable, but perhaps superior. It felt like a relentless march of history, and the West was on the defensive. This power was built on a foundation of absolute control. The Communist Party was the only party. It dictated every aspect of life, from what you read in the newspaper to the job you were assigned. The state owned everything, the factories, the farms, the apartments. Dissent was not tolerated. The KGB, the infamous state security agency, was everywhere. Its network of informants ensured that any whisper of opposition was silenced. Fear was a tool of the state. For generations, this was simply the reality for hundreds of millions of people. But behind this iron facade, a different story was unfolding. The image of power was just that, an image. It was a carefully constructed narrative designed to mask deep, systemic weaknesses. The giant had feet of clay. What was it really like to live in the Soviet Union? The answer is complex. It was a life of profound contradictions. The state promised a worker's paradise, a society free from the inequality and exploitation of capitalism. And in some ways, it delivered. Education was free and universal. Healthcare was accessible to all at no cost. The government guaranteed every citizen a job. Unemployment, at least officially, did not exist. This stability, however, came at a steep price. The lack of economic competition created a world of scarcity and inefficiency. While Americans shopped in gleaming supermarkets filled with endless choices, Soviet citizens faced a different reality. Long lines or queues were a daily ritual. People would wait for hours for basic necessities like bread, milk, sausage. The quality of goods was often poor. The state-run factories had no incentive to innovate or improve. The joke was common. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. It was a system that stifled ambition and rewarded conformity. Personal freedom was a concept that simply did not exist. The state controlled the flow of information completely. Newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia printed only the party line. Western music, movies, books were banned, seen as decadent and corrupting influences. To be caught with a Beatles album or a copy of George Orwell's 1984 could lead to serious trouble. Travel outside the communist bloc was nearly impossible for the average person. The world beyond the Iron Curtain was a mystery, a place known only through the distorted lens of state propaganda. Yet, despite the repression, the human spirit endured. People found ways to live, to love, and to find joy. They gathered in their small kitchens, sharing jokes and forbidden information whispered over glasses of vodka. They listened to smuggled Western rock and roll on faint radio signals. They read secretly circulated, self-published manuscripts known as samizdat. There was a deep sense of community forged in shared hardship. This hidden, private world stood in stark contrast to the gray, monolithic public face of the Soviet state. It was a quiet rebellion, a testament to the unquenchable desire for something more. By the early 1980s, the Soviet system was in a state of crisis. The cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The economy, the very engine of the state, was sputtering. It was a command economy, planned from the top down by bureaucrats in Moscow. This rigid system was incapable of adapting to the modern world. While the United States was experiencing a technological revolution with computers and microchips, the Soviet economy was stuck in a bygone era of steel and concrete. It could produce tanks and rockets, but it could not produce enough quality consumer goods to satisfy its own people. The shelves grew emptier, the lines grew longer. Then came the war in Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into the neighboring country to prop up a friendly communist government. Moscow expected a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves bogged down in a brutal decade-long guerrilla war. It became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The conflict drained the treasury of billions of rubles. It cost the lives of thousands of young Soviet soldiers. News of the mounting casualties, though heavily censored, trickled back home, sowing disillusionment and grief. The war shattered the myth of the invincible Red Army and became a bleeding wound that the empire could not heal. Meanwhile, a new kind of arms race was pushing the Soviet economy to the breaking point. U.S. President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. It was an ambitious and perhaps fantastical plan to build a space-based missile defense shield. The Soviets were terrified. They knew their lagging technology could not compete. To even try would mean diverting what little resources they had away from the civilian economy. It was a strategic masterstroke by Washington. It forced Moscow into a race it could not afford to run, exposing the deep technological and economic gap between the two superpowers. The final blow came from a disaster that was both real and symbolic. On April 26, 1986, a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded. It was the worst nuclear disaster in history. The initial response from the Soviet government was one of secrecy and denial. They tried to cover it up, but the radioactive cloud spread across Europe, and the truth could not be contained. Chernobyl exposed the incompetence, the lies, and the decay at the heart of the Soviet system. For many citizens, it was the moment they lost all faith in their government. The foundation of the empire was not just cracked, it was crumbling. In 1985, a new kind of leader came to power in the Kremlin. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. He was younger, more energetic, and more open-minded than the aging, doctrinaire leaders who came before him. Gorbachev was a true believer in communism, but he was not blind. He saw the deep sickness infecting the Soviet system. He knew that without drastic change, the USSR was doomed to collapse. He believed he could reform the system to save it from itself. It was a monumental gamble, one that would have consequences he could never have imagined. His intentions were to fix the empire, not to destroy it. Gorbachev introduced two radical new policies. The first was Perestroika, or restructuring. This was an attempt to revitalize the stagnant Soviet economy. It allowed for small-scale private businesses, gave more autonomy to state-run factories, and sought to introduce elements of market competition. The goal was to make the economy more efficient and productive, to make it work for the people again. It was a direct challenge to the old top-down command system that had been in place for decades. It was a step away from the rigid orthodoxy that had defined Soviet life for generations. His second, and perhaps more explosive policy, was glasnost, or openness. Gorbachev believed that economic reform could not succeed without political and social openness. He relaxed censorship. He allowed for greater freedom of speech and the press. Suddenly, forbidden topics were being discussed openly. The crimes of Stalin, the corruption of party officials, the economic failures. It all came pouring out. Newspapers and television programs began to report the truth, not just the party line. It was like a dam breaking. Decades of pent-up frustration and anger were unleashed upon a public that was shocked and hungry for more. The combination of perestroika and glasnost proved to be a volatile cocktail. Perestroika, instead of fixing the economy, initially made things worse. It dismantled the old system without an effective new one to replace it, leading to massive disruptions, shortages, and inflation. Glasnost, meanwhile, gave people the freedom to complain about it. It allowed nationalist movements in the various Soviet republics, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine. Gorbachev had hoped to create a more dynamic and humane form of socialism. Instead, he had uncorked a genie of freedom and discontent that he could no longer control. The winds of change blowing from Moscow did not stop at the Soviet border. They swept across Eastern Europe, the collection of satellite states held in the USSR's orbit since the end of World War II. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, oppressive communist regimes propped up by the threat of Soviet tanks. But now, Gorbachev made a stunning declaration. He announced the Soviet Union would no longer use force to keep these regimes in power. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. He was letting them go. The effect was immediate and electric. One by one, the people of Eastern Europe rose up. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union movement, once banned, won a stunning victory in free elections. In Hungary, the government began dismantling the barbed wire fence along its border with Austria, creating the first tear in the Iron Curtain. A wave of peaceful velvet revolutions swept across the region. The old hardline communist leaders found themselves isolated and powerless. The people had lost their fear. They tasted freedom, and they would not be denied. It was a domino effect in reverse, as regimes fell with breathtaking speed. The most dramatic moment came in Germany. The Berlin Wall was the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, a concrete and barbed wire scar that divided a city, a nation, a continent. On the night of November 9, 1989, a confused East German official mistakenly announced that citizens were free to cross the border. The news spread like wildfire. Thousands of East Berliners streamed towards the checkpoints. The overwhelmed guards, without clear orders, simply opened the gates. The world watched, stunned, as people danced on top of the wall, chipping away at it with hammers, picks. It was the party at the end of history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just a symbolic event. It was the death knell for the Soviet Empire in Europe. It signaled that the division of the continent was over. The Cold War, for all intents and purposes, had been won, not by a military victory, but by the will of ordinary people demanding freedom. For the United States and the West, it was a moment of profound triumph. The policy of containment had worked. The ideology of democracy had prevailed. But for the Soviet Union, it was a catastrophic loss of prestige and power, a sign that the unraveling was accelerating beyond anyone's control. With Eastern Europe gone, the Soviet Union itself began to fracture. The spirit of independence that had swept the satellite states now ignited within the USSR's own borders. The 15 republics that made up the Union were not a single unified nation. They were a collection of diverse peoples, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and more, all forced into the empire. Fueled by glasnost, long-suppressed national identities re-emerged. Parliaments in these republics began declaring their sovereignty, challenging the authority of Moscow. The very fabric of the Soviet state was tearing apart. The crisis came to a head in August 1991. A group of hardline communist officials launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea and sent tanks into the streets of Moscow. They announced that they were taking control to restore order, but they had misjudged the mood of the people. The citizens of Moscow who had tasted freedom were not willing to give it up. They poured into the streets to resist the coup, building barricades and standing in front of the tanks. The face of the resistance was Boris Yeltsin, the popularly elected president of the Russian Republic. In a moment of incredible bravery, he climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called on the people to defy the coup plotters. It became the defining image of the empire's collapse. The coup fell apart within 3 days. The plotters were arrested and Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But he returned to a country that had fundamentally changed. The coup had destroyed his authority and fatally weakened the Central Soviet government. The real power now lay with Yeltsin and the leaders of the individual republics. The end came swiftly. In the weeks that followed the failed coup, one republic after another declared its full independence. The Soviet Union was ceasing to exist. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a secluded hunting lodge. They signed an accord that officially dissolved the Soviet Union and created a loose commonwealth of independent states in its place. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev gave a televised address to the nation. He announced his resignation as president of a country that no longer existed. That evening, the red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The end of the Soviet Union was one of the most significant geopolitical events of the 20th century. It redrew the map of Europe and Asia. It ended the Cold War, a conflict that had defined global politics for nearly 50 years. The immediate aftermath was a period of both hope and chaos. For the United States, it seemed like a final victory, the end of history, where liberal democracy had triumphed. For the people of the former Soviet bloc, it was a chance to build new free nations. But it also unleashed ethnic conflicts and severe economic hardship that would plague the region for years to come. The collapse had a profound impact on the global balance of power. The world went from being bipolar, dominated by two rival superpowers, to unipolar, with the United States as the sole remaining superpower. This unipolar moment shaped American foreign policy for decades, leading to interventions in places like the Balkans and the Middle East. It also created a power vacuum in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The expansion of NATO into former Soviet territory, an alliance created to contain the USSR, has become a major source of tension with modern Russia, which views it as an encroachment on its sphere of influence. For Russia, the legacy of the collapse is a source of deep national trauma. Many Russians experienced the 1990s as a decade of humiliation, economic collapse, and loss of status on the world stage. This sense of a lost empire has fueled a powerful nostalgia and a desire to restore Russia's greatness. The current political climate in Russia, including its actions in places like Chechnya, Georgia, and most significantly Ukraine, cannot be understood without understanding this deep-seated feeling of grievance. The echoes of the empire's fall are heard in the speeches and policies coming from the Kremlin today. More than 30 years later, the story of the Soviet collapse remains incredibly relevant. It is a stark reminder that no empire is permanent. It shows how systems built on repression and economic inefficiency are ultimately unsustainable. It demonstrates the powerful, unpredictable force of ideas like freedom and national identity. The world we live in today, the conflicts, the alliances, the very distribution of power, was forged in the crucible of the Soviet Union's dramatic and sudden end. Understanding why that iron giant fell is essential to understanding the challenges and complexities of our modern world. The shocking truth is that the ghost of the USSR still haunts us.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more simple explanations.